Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first book launch webinar for 2023. Today we have Melanie O'Brien, the president of the IAGS, to present her new book, From Discrimination to Death, Genocide Process Through a Human Rights Lens. Our discussant today would be Panayotis Diamadis. He's the director of the Australian Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, founded by the late Professor Colin Tatz. Diamadis' doctoral thesis demonstrated why the genocide of the Hellenist Greeks constitutes genocide under international law. Known as a specialist in the genocides of the Armenians, Assyrians, and Hellenists, Diamadis is the author and co-author of numerous scholarly and mass media articles, including controversies around governmental and parliamentary recognition of the Armenian, Hellenic, and Assyrian genocides in the Routledge imprint, Controversies in the Field of Genocide Studies. A prolific public speaker, Diamadis has lectured in Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Greece, Austria, and Great Britain. A student of Colin Tatz, he has been active in comparative genocide studies in 1998 and has dedicated his life to political, academic, and social recognition of the genocides of the Armenians, Assyrians, and Hellenists. And as for the author, we have Melanie O'Brien. She's an associate professor of international law at the University of Western Australia and an award-winning teacher of international humanitarian law, public international law, and legal research. Her research examines the connection between human rights and the genocide process and sexual and gender-based crimes against women in atrocities. She has conducted fieldwork and research across 6 continents. Her work on forced marriage has been cited by the International Criminal Court, and she has appeared before the ICC as an amicus curiae and has been an expert consultant for several UN bodies. Melanie is also the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, and she co-convened the 2017 conference of the association at the University of Queensland. She also has served on the editorial board of Genocide Studies and Prevention Journal from 2013 to 2017. And she's also an Australian Red Cross Western Australia International Humanitarian Law Committee member and is on the editorial board of Human Rights Review. Melanie is also admitted as an admitted legal practitioner who has previously worked at several Australian universities, the National Human Rights Institution of Samoa, and the legal advisory section of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. She's the author of the Criminalizing Peacekeepers, Modernizing National Approaches to Sexual Exploitation and Abuse. And today she will present and talk about her recent book, From Discrimination to Death, Genocide Process Through a Human Rights Lens, published by Routledge. A big welcome to Melanie and Panos, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
I think I'm unmuted.
Mel, you can start. You have.
Yeah, Panos is up.
Am I unmuted now? Yes, you can hear me.
We can hear you, but it's very quiet.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
I'll use my teacher's voice. Good evening from Australia. Good morning to much of the world, or good afternoon. Thank you, Mel and Elisan, for the introduction. And Mel, thank you for allowing me or inviting me to present your, let's call it a masterpiece. I think it is. From Discrimination to Death, Genocide Process Through a Human Rights Lens. The most interesting aspect of the book is that it takes a legal approach and a human rights, specifically a human rights approach to understanding how genocides happen, rather than the traditional historical and sociological approaches that we're used to. You've used a number of different case studies, drawing from, of course, the Holocaust, the Shoah, but also Armenia, Cambodia, and your personal recent research in the last few years, particularly pre-COVID, with the Rohingya of Myanmar and Bangladesh, obviously. So rather than me talking about the book, what I would like to do is ask you a series of questions around the book and around how you produced this very interesting text. I will say at the beginning, Mel, that one thing I did love the most about it was it is very readable. You have not drowned it in jargon, which is really important, I think, not only for a specialist audience, but also for a general audience. So I'll start with, From Discrimination to Death, you note that, and I quote, "Research is never conducted in a vacuum," referring to the many people who assisted you in your research. How do genocide scholars go about doing research in so many countries around the world where they don't live and have to start on the ground from scratch?
Thank you. It's a great opening question. And I'm really glad to hear that you think the book is readable. It's something that I've always worked on. When I studied law, we were trained in plain legal English, and how important it was that even if we were writing something legal, that it would be comprehensible to someone who wasn't a lawyer. So it always pleases me to know that people find my work readable. So that's great. Thinking about your question, this is, I think this is something really important to start with and think about. So at the beginning of my book, I have several pages of acknowledgements of people in different countries around the world, because I could not have done this research without them. And, it is, how do we, especially when you're first starting out as a researcher, how do you do this research? If you're based in Australia, for example, I mean, I did my PhD in the UK, but, how do you start researching in Cambodia, or how do you research the Holocaust, which covers so many different countries and et cetera? And I think the first thing is network with your fellow scholars, because there's someone amongst us, and IAGS is an absolute goldmine of scholars. Yep. There's someone who's been there to that country before, and they've already got contacts and they know how it works. So for example, Alex Hinton was incredibly useful for me in laying the groundwork to go to Cambodia before I got there. He'd already done years of work there. So approaching scholars, hopefully you've come to IAGS conferences and got to know some of the scholars, but even if you've never met them before, people can be really, really helpful and willing to give you a hand. And they're willing to not only connect you with the people on the ground that they know and have worked with, but maybe also give you tips about, what's the best way to go about doing work in this particular culture. So that's really useful. So essentially in doing this though, importantly, you have to plan ahead. So you have to plan before you get there. You can't leave it until you actually land on the ground. You have to get in contact with people well before you go there, not just the scholars who've been there, but as many people on the ground as you can to get things organized. Organize the time in the archives that you're going to. Make sure that you're booked in, make sure that you know everything you need to access the archives. Are they going to charge you for entry, for example? Do you need ID to get in? All of these kinds of things, make sure you've sorted that out before you get there. In saying that, of course, there are plenty of things that you can't plan in advance. So you also need to be prepared to move very quickly when you're on the ground. So using local contacts to make more connections with their contacts to further your research. Everything snowballs when you get there, and once you've made that personal connection with the local people, then it snowballs into connections with other people on the ground. And I say that, but you will always end up, after you've come back, you will always find out things afterwards that you wish you had known and that you could have done. And you're like, oh, that would have been really useful, but that's just something to put in the notes to remember for the next time that you go there. So I think that's really how to go about doing this kind of research, other than, of course, starting with the texts that people have written, and so having that background knowledge, but it is using your networks before you go and, you know, using your IAGS networks.
And of course, coming from a rather monolingual country like Australia, having a second or a third language, which is quite typical for Europeans and basically most of the world, also I've found really does help. English, of course, is the world language, but.
No, I agree with you. Although, to be honest, once you start doing so many different case studies, you can't possibly get across all of the languages. You know, I'm not fluent in Khmer and and Hebrew and Bosnian and all of the other case studies that I work on. It's really difficult. I always make an effort. You know, I have a phrase book and I make an effort at all of the basics, but you know, beyond the other languages that I speak, it's becoming a lot. No, I don't speak Armenian either. I keep wanting to go in and spend time in Armenia to learn the language, but yeah, time and funding.
Particularly funding. The funding typically brings the time. From discrimination to death, genocide processed through a human rights lens draws on your research into the, as I mentioned in my introduction, the genocide of the Armenians, of European and North African Jewry, of the peoples of Cambodia, and of the Rohingya of Myanmar. These events cover a time period of almost a century and a half, and a very large geographic area, about a third of the world across 2 continents. Please take us through your conscious decisions in relating these particular cases of genocide, seemingly quite diverse, to illustrate that genocide occurs through escalating human rights violations.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a key question, isn't it? Why did I choose these case studies? And I think the whole idea was to choose diverse case studies, to see whether there were differences in the human rights pattern between each of them, or were there similarities? And of course, we know, you know, so many of us do comparative genocide studies, and we know that comparative research helps to ensure the validity and the rigor of research findings through a more complete picture of the study variables. Essentially, so multiple case studies ensures the reliability of your findings. And in the case of my book, those findings are then demonstrated by the application of the findings to the Rohingya genocide. And I guess also I was interested to see, and while this is not something that I specifically address in the book explicitly, I was interested to see whether the genocide process changed over time in how it was carried out. You know, we're talking about one in 1915, one in the 1940s, one in the 1970s, and then the Rohingya genocide in current times. So did the process change at all, you know, perhaps due to technological advances or changes in society? You know, globalization has changed society a lot. And even, of course, the introduction of the international human rights law and general international law system during that time. So while I don't explore that specifically in the book, it definitely is evident reading it that none of such advances or changes matter to the genocide process, and that it continues to follow a particular pattern. And I think one of the best examples is looking at freedom of expression, where I look at the control of the media and how it has existed through all of the genocides. But what changed was the way it was carried out. Because of changes in technology, you know, we didn't have mass media in the time of the Armenian genocide. Now we not only have mass media, but we have social media. So even though the way it has carried out has changed, the fact that the genocidal regimes sought to control the narrative and sought to control the media has always been there. So essentially, the way it's carried out may change, but the specific violations that take place won't. And I, you know, in choosing these, comparing these very different genocide case studies brought out similarities and differences, which I thought were really interesting. And as an example, as you go through the book, the chapters get longer and longer, and you know, because there was just so much material growing, and the chapter on torture is quite lengthy. But what I found was that there may have been differences between the genocides in how they carried out torture, but within each genocide, there was a pattern. There was a systematic way that those regimes carried out torture all throughout the territory that they were carrying out the genocide. So I thought that was really interesting. You know, there's a guarantee that torture is part of it, carried out differently between them, but it shows, and to me, that's part of what shows that genocide is systematic. And, you know, this argument from the Turkish government that the Armenian genocide wasn't genocide, well, no, this is systematic nature of everything definitely demonstrates that it was, that the torture was carried out in the same way as they moved across the territories. And it was the same. And something, on a side note, something really interesting that I discovered, which I think you can, you know, it's the type of little tidbit that you can only find once you really start drilling into the details of all of the places like concentration camps and death camps, is that I found that the Nazis were obsessed with whipping bare bottoms. And this was a punishment meted out across multiple of the campsites. And it wasn't, I didn't realize, so one of the camps I went to, they had this special table that they had made that they would put the prisoners over and pull their pants down and whip their bottoms. And, you know, I was shocked that they had actually made a table. But as I put my research together, I realized this happened at multiple camps. They made a special table specifically for this particular form of torture. So that was a really interesting, really specific little detail that I found, but was part of this idea, you know, this concept of comparing different case studies.
So this is psychological warfare is part of all our genocide all our genocide cases. And I think you'll agree that these various forms of torture that you brought up and that you mentioned here, and again, that's one of the things I enjoyed, it's a strange word to use about genocide, a book about genocide, but from your book, is that you don't get bogged down in the gory details of how torture was conducted. You refer to the actual practices and you move on, and keeping your focus on this is part of a process. This is part of the psychological warfare. This is part of, so whether it's geographic isolation from the eyes of the world, which, as you pointed out, in the pre-digital age was far easier than it is today. It is very difficult unless you're in a relatively remote corner of the world like the South Caucasus.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the torture forms a key, it's an absolute key part of this process. You know, and the human rights narrative about torture and its goal, that fits perfectly within the way that genocidaires use torture. You know, it's this idea to cause pain and suffering. You know, the traditional definition, which has been moved away from, which is, you know, interrogation to get information from someone. We don't use that anymore. But it's this idea of seeking to cause pain and suffering. And that is a specific goal of genocidal regimes. So it fits perfectly within the process for them. And it's an essential part of that process.
And fits with the sole legal definition of genocide, the physical harm, the intention to cause physical harm or
absolutely
mental harm.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on, because we could go off on these tangents constantly.
The torture chapter is very long. I could talk about that for a full hour.
I did actually not find it very long. Well, compared to the other chapters in the book, yes, it is very long, but I'm actually surprised how you managed to condense it. This amazing breadth, and you've kept it down to, okay, let's don't worry about the index. You've kept it down to 300, yeah, just under 300 pages. It's like, it's not. I'm sorry. It's not a volume that is odious to to tackle. It's quite readable and it's quite manageable at just under 300 pages.
Well, my publisher will be happy to hear that, because I can assure you that I went over the agreed word limit. But thank you to Adam Jones, who's the series editor, who supported me and didn't want them to cut anything out of it.
This is why it's always good to have friends. You mentioned the networking before. Networking is always important.
Absolutely.
From discrimination to death, genocide processed through a human rights lens concludes with, and I quote, the human rights violations paradigm as prevention. Kindly unpack your demonstration of the intrinsic relationship between human rights and genocide. In other words, to illustrate how, and again I quote, human rights and international criminal justice systems have not engaged with human rights violations as they form part of the genocide process.
So the main premise of my book is that the genocide process can and should be seen as a pattern of human rights violations. So what I've done in the book and the way it's structured is each chapter looks at a different right or group of related rights. So for example, such as freedom from torture or the rights to education and culture, they go together. And I examine conduct from the 3 case studies to see how do they fit. So I start the chapter by talking through the human right or human rights and what they are, and then say, here's how those rights were violated in the 3 case studies. And essentially what I found, so looking for similarities or differences in the pattern, I did find that there was a pattern in all of the 3 case studies. And the pattern that I found through this research means that human rights law can and should be used as a midstream prevention tool. So in other words, when human rights bodies like the UN has human rights treaty bodies that monitor the implementation of human rights treaties. So we have the Human Rights Committee that monitors the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example. So when these treaty bodies are monitoring human rights violations, and when they see this particular pattern that I found in my book, when they see this pattern occurring, they can raise the alarm and take action at that point. So the goal is then to prevent the process from progressing to the later stages where then the violence escalates and people die. So the later stages, so just to talk everyone through the order of the rights, and while I'm not saying that this is a precise linear process, one happens and then the next happens, there's overlap, but it's an approximate temporal escalation. So I start with freedom of discrimination, which is overarching and continues obviously throughout the whole process. Then freedom of expression and opinion, education and cultural rights, employment, political and fair trial rights, freedom of religion, family and privacy rights, child rights. Then we escalate to the next level. So this is the point where I foresee human rights bodies stepping in before we get to the next level. So the next level, which is part 3 of the book, is freedom of movement, liberty and security of person and slavery. So essentially confinement, this is where we start to see people being put in ghettos and camps. The rights to health and adequate standard of living, which is actually the point where we see people starting to die. And then the final escalation is freedom from torture and the right to life. And so my argument is that, before we get to that part 3 stage, that the human rights treaty bodies can say, this pattern is happening. It's not that we are on track for genocide, we are in genocide. We are in the middle of genocide. And in terms of the second part of your question, in terms of international criminal justice, the way that courts have perceived genocide is not so much as a human rights violation. So they tend not to use the language of human rights as such. And this contrasts with the way that international criminal courts frame other atrocity crimes, such as crimes against humanity, which often have direct reference to human rights. So, for example, the crime against humanity of persecution, which is often a fallback crime if prosecutors feel they can't prove genocide. So the crime against humanity of persecution in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court is actually defined as the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. But here's this key, it's deprivation of rights. So the crime's very definition talks about human rights, but this kind of direct engagement by international criminal law with human rights in terms of the substantive law of genocide is missing. So I'm hoping that this book will encourage more of that engagement from the courts, but also what I'm hoping it will do is encourage them to prosecute for genocide crimes other than killing. Because all of what I talk about is genocide. It's part of the process. You can't have the killing at the end without all of these stages beforehand. They are part of the process. And at the end of every single chapter, I say, okay, this is the conduct we're talking about. Which genocide crime would this fit in? And every single one of them fits within a genocide crime. So every single one of these categories of rights violations is possible for prosecutors to bring charges for genocide against. So that's this connection that I've made and that I'm hoping that prosecutors and courts will make in the future.
So this is where I believe IAGS and professional bodies like IAGS have a role to play and are playing. I know IAGS at least is playing it now in today's world. So we have, and I'll give an example right now. We're into the 85th day of the blockade of Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. Complete cutoff. No one allowed in, no one allowed out. 120,000 plus people in complete isolation. IAGS has made a statement. The International Court of Justice has just declared the blockade illegal. So at least some courts are listening to your proposal of actually going beyond statements, which is all IAGS can really do, and actually bring out legally binding judgments, which then goes to the real problem of enforcement, which has been the problem since the beginning of the UN Convention, which is beyond our scope.
Yeah, but, don't get me started on that.
We might, if we've got time at the end, we might come back to it, because it's something that has always fascinated me, that the lack of international will, the lack of will for any sort of international mechanism of enforcement. Because as you said, the discrimination, the language of discrimination, the acts of discrimination, this is all setting up what happens next. And so in some cases, this goes for years. In the case of the Armenians and the Assyrians and the Greeks, it took centuries. In the case of European Jewry, almost 2 millennia. But even when the Nazis came in, you remember, we're coming up in a couple of weeks to the anniversary of the Nazi boycott in 1933. It was a complete failure because they hadn't done that preparation, that psychological preparation of the population. The same people who ignored the boycott in 33 were killing by 1940-41. So, and this is where I think probably the most important contribution from discrimination to death is that you shine that focus, that this is a process. The killing just doesn't happen. It sometimes takes years. So I don't know how many judges are going to read it, but we're going to keep promoting it anyway, because it really is the only way to go about it. Where am I up to? Form part of the process. Following on from our legal discussion, human rights law is a relatively new concept, yet your book includes material from cases of genocide from more than a century ago. Please tell us how you deal with issues of retrospectivity.
So even though I'm talking about law, the book it's not a court case. So
No.
I'm not seeking to prosecute the perpetrators retrospectively. So, it's not an issue. Instead, what I'm doing is using historical examples to form a theory about the process of genocide with the goal of determining if a pattern exists that could be used to prevent and prosecute future genocide. That being said, of course, the human rights law certainly could be applied, though, to the Cambodian and the Rohingya genocides, because those did take place after the creation of the
Absolutely.
international human rights law system. Yeah.
So you go along with that answer, but okay. Children. Children have very specific experiences in genocide. For example, Jewish children and the children of other select groups such as the Romani were targeted for death by their perpetrators. In the cases of the Armenians, Assyrians, and Hellenes or Greeks, underage children and teenagers were very often targeted for forced assimilation, forced marriage into the perpetrator group. Please discuss how you dealt with these challenges while writing From Discrimination to Death.
Okay. I have quite a lengthy answer for this because there are a lot of elements to unpack with what you've asked. So I have a chapter on child rights. And to start with, to explain, child rights come from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CROC, as we call it for short. International lawyers love acronyms. So what I note at the beginning of the chapter is that there are many rights that exist in CROC that overlap with rights that we find in other treaties, more general rights. And so what I've done is those rights are dealt with in the other chapters where they're relevant to the genocide process. So for example, forced conversion and deconversion, that's discussed in the chapter on freedom of religion. Killing is looked at in the chapter on the right to life. And education is covered in the chapter on education and culture rights. Those examples include children's stories, which I'll come to in a moment. But so just to say, in the child rights chapter, I focus on specific child rights, particularly family and identity rights that apply to children. Because of course we have the broader right to family, but there are specific rights that apply to children, such as when we're talking about identity, the right to have an identity, to have, identity documents, a name, to know where you were born, and these kinds of aspects which disappear for children, particularly those born during the times of genocide. I also looked at the right to rest and leisure or play, and which I think was really interesting. I touched briefly on child trafficking and exploitation as well, but for me, I think this right to rest and leisure or play was really interesting and not something that people would normally think about when they think about what happens in genocide. And essentially what I found is that play and recreation are essential to the health and well-being of children, but they're also play and leisure and recreation are also about learning and socialization. Yes. So when we take away the ability of children to play, to essentially have fun, we also take away their development, their social development, their mental development, their mental health as well, their cognitive development, their personal development. So all of this is taken away from them. But I found really interesting examples of how children continue to play in some of them. And I wanted to read a little bit from the book that was something that really struck me. Even in horrific circumstances, children retained an element of the inherent and spontaneous playfulness of a child, albeit with macabre designs. Blutinger reveals that children in the ghetto, and obviously this is in the Holocaust ghettos, played games such as going through the gate of the ghetto, grave digging, in which Hitler was symbolically buried, and blockade, where children pretended to avoid roundups. Henrik Ross, the famous photographer in the Łódź ghetto, he captured a photograph in the Łódź ghetto of children playing as Jewish policemen capturing an offender. In Ravensbrück, children played Appell based on the camp's roll calls, in which the children acted out victims and perpetrators. In a children thematic survivor testimony video compilation that I saw at Gedenkstätte Bergen-Belsen, various survivors discuss being a child in the concentration camp. They speak of playing by counting dead bodies in a pile or jumping over dead bodies, and how this was simply normal because there was no other life. And I quote one of the survivors, "We hung around, we stepped in puddles, we counted the dead." I remember that very well, counting the dead. I compared the piles of bodies because they were stacked up like logs. This pile's got 40, this one's got 35. I remember that. I remember playing hopscotch with dying people and dead people around me. I remember that very well indeed. So these testimonies are consistent with the finding of Eisen, which was that children's play was not divorced from reality. In fact, play was reflective of it, and it articulated skills for survival as well. So play, rather than being fun and frivolous, reflected the seriousness of the surroundings. So it's interesting. I found that really fascinating that children were still playing, not only still playing in these contexts, but that the context became part of their playing. And if you think about the quote where the woman is saying, oh, you know, I was counting. Counting is, of course, part of learning, isn't it? It's part of the development, you know, knowing numbers, counting, etc. So they were still doing this kind of development, even though they were talking about piles of dead bodies. So to me, that was something that people wouldn't normally think of, but really came through to me in the research. And part of that is because children's experiences are inevitable when you are exploring what happens in genocide.
Yes.
And that is in part because of source availability as well as a researcher. So many survivor stories come from those who were children during the genocide. So for example, you have Long Ung's book, First They Killed My Father, the book that Angelina Jolie made an amazing movie from. Dith Pran, another survivor, he compiled an edited collection called Children of Cambodia's Killing Fields, Memoirs of Survivors. So writing genocide memoirs was not something that survivors, you know, necessarily thought of doing. You know, of course, straight after the Armenian genocide, it wasn't a thing, I guess. And not many came out after the Holocaust, in the couple of decades after the Holocaust either. But then in more recent decades, there's been quite the proliferation. And in terms of thinking about interviews, so my research for this included interviews with survivors, obviously not of the Armenian genocide because they have passed away now, but survivors from the other genocides, and of course, particularly survivors from the Holocaust, the ones who are alive now were definitely, they were very young children at the time. And the Cambodian survivors that I talked to, they were also children at the time. So including children's stories is inevitable because, you know, in part because of this, as time goes by, the access to survivors' stories. And I do also want to say that I include children's experiences in the chapter about the refugee stage. So I haven't mentioned that yet, but the final stage I look at is the refugee stage, and I include that as part of the genocide process because I don't look at refugee rights as in the rights under the Refugee Convention, but I look generally at how refugees experience human rights and the violations that they experience. And my argument is that what they experience is inevitable because they all have very similar experiences, and so that the genocidaires are responsible for what happens to the refugees as well. And so as an example, like talking about children, when I talk about violations of the right to family for refugees, so for example, you know, loss of family, but also separation from family, I found a really striking story from a Cambodian survivor who came to Australia, Suor Hai Gov, and he was young. He was 13 by the time he came to Australia. So during the Cambodian genocide, he lost his parents, he lost his siblings, and then somehow he found his two uncles. But neither of them wanted him. They just saw him as a burden. And they basically fought because neither of them wanted him. And in the end, one of them took him with their own children, and they came to Australia. And you would think that this would lead to a much better life, but Suor Hai Gov was treated horrifically by his uncle. He was made to work. He was 13 and he was made to work to pay off the debt of being saved and being brought to Australia. He was never allowed to play, so his cousins would be playing and he had to work. And he was also verbally and physically abused. And so he really struggled as a child, you know, going to school and living in a violent and abusive household. So even though technically he still had family because they were his family, he didn't really have any family left because of the way they treated him. And once he finished high school, he left and he went to university, and you know, he made a great life for himself. Yeah. But I just, you know, children's stories continue even after they leave the territory of genocide.
The children and the refugee sections, when I was reading them, especially the children one, brought to my mind some footage, there's only a few minutes of it, of children playing in essentially refugee camps in Athens after the Holocaust of Smyrna in September of 22. And there's no voice, so we don't actually know what they're actually playing, but it looks like some sort of, you know, we're going to catch you. They're all in a circle and there's one pulls out and suddenly runs around, and again it looks like adaptation to their circumstances.
Looks like a roundup.
Children's games. I have interviewed a few Greek genocide survivors who later migrated to Australia. They're all gone now. I'm sorry. None of them referred to games or to play. Even in the pre-genocide period, where they would have been 5, 6, 7, they would have had some memories. They either consciously or subconsciously did not speak about or did not want to speak about play, which is not unusual because one of them was married at 15.
It just wasn't a part of their life. Like it is.
It wasn't. There was no time
like
for
it should be.
In a normal situation, definitely.
Yeah.
But he only lived in the next suburb for the final part of his life. He died at 103, which, considering what he went through, is remarkable. But was married at 15. And when I asked, why did your mother, because his father was lost in the genocide, why did your mother marry you off at 15? Because we needed to replace the ones who were lost. Their primary concern, perhaps even before
was continuing,
reestablishing their life, rebuilding their lives, was continuing the line.
Yeah.
And the children are the only way to continue the line, to continue the family. So with sticking with children, I'm going to throw an idea at you. You may like it, you may hate it, but following on from discrimination to death, consider, if not a full book, at least a study of Australia. First Nations people of Australia, perhaps.
So obviously I don't touch on any Indigenous genocides in this, but I would
noticed that.
I would very much, I mean, because obviously you can't do every single case study. You know, Rwanda's not in there either, but I would like to take the time to apply the pattern to Indigenous genocides to see if it works there. So I probably should make clear that in saying that this pattern exists, I'm not saying that genocide only occurs if it follows this pattern. But what I'm saying is if this pattern does exist, then it's genocide. So, for example, I could apply it to Indigenous genocides and find that it doesn't fit. I mean, it may fit, but it may not. So, I'm open when I try to apply it to other case studies. I'm open to it not fitting, which will be interesting in itself.
With Indigenous genocides, I think what you'll find is the lack of evidence, or at least contemporary evidence, from the victims' perspectives.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean,
The lack of written sources.
Difficult. And that was, one of the limitations that I acknowledge when I talk about methodology, the limitations of this research, in that there were some aspects that I could find so much information about with regards to the Holocaust and Cambodia, no problem, but Armenia couldn't find anything. So there are some parts of some chapters and some aspects where there's a lot of information about the Holocaust and Cambodia, but not so much about Armenia, or occasionally nothing at all if I just couldn't find anything. And, part of that is fewer survivor memoirs, obviously no survivors alive today. The main source that I used for the Armenian genocide is an amazing collection of survivor testimonies that I think it was in the 6 months before I got to the National Archives, had been published in English, had been translated. And they were testimonies that were taken in the aftermath by Armenians who had arrived in Eastern Armenia, and their testimonies were taken. And so this is a really great source. I recommend it to anyone. It's really thick. There's a lot in there, but that makes it an incredible source, and it's fresh. It's testimonies recorded at the time, essentially. So it was a really amazing source. And just so when you're looking through testimonies like that, when they're all there together, even if they're not necessarily long, each of them, you really see the pattern of the violence and how it takes place.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, because time is beginning to run out. I didn't think we would run out of time, but we are. We've done children. Today is International Women's Day. Konya pola to all women everywhere. We're thankful for. See, I'm outnumbered in my household, so I have to say this. And pertinently, your book is written from a feminist perspective. Tell us how you applied this approach to your book, to the book.
Yeah, so this was a really important thing. All of my work is feminist, and there are several ways that I incorporated it in this book. So first of all was incorporating and prioritizing women's experiences through the book. So it doesn't just tell the story of men, but in fact is skewed towards telling the experiences of women. And this is part of the bigger idea of genocide being an active participant in the book, is showing these different experiences. I also ensured that I really looked for sources by women as well. So secondary sources as well as obviously primary sources. So supporting women scholars. I did a lot of interviews for the book with Holocaust survivors, Cambodian genocide survivors, and Rohingya women. And my interviews with the Rohingya were only with women, actually. And that was in part because I had a very limited time that I was able to be in the refugee camps, and I needed to shape my ethics application to be able to fit within the time frame I had, which was very short. And so I just decided that I would focus on women's stories. But that fits with the research I do more broadly anyway. So when I conduct interviews, I carry them out with a feminist do no harm ethos, which means carrying your interviews out with empathy and understanding, and ensuring that your interview subjects feel comfortable. I had, so many people actually really grateful to be interviewed. And I think this is, we talk about impact of academics' work, and it's a lot harder for us than it is for someone who's trying to cure cancer, for example. But for me, the biggest impact that we have is getting to speak with survivors of such extraordinary atrocities, and that they trust us enough to tell us their story, but how meaningful it is for them to have someone who is willing to just sit there as long as it takes for them to tell their story and to listen to that story and believe that story. Because some of them, like, I interviewed people in Cambodia who had never told anyone their story. Like, one woman said, oh, when I try to talk to my family, they don't believe me. So, you know, just, and the cathartic nature of the interviews, you know, people talk about the concern of re-traumatization, but actually a lot of these people, it was very cathartic for them to tell their stories. And one survivor in Cambodia, she started crying the minute she started telling her story. And of course, you know, I said, oh, if it's too much, you know, absolutely don't need, etc. And she said, no, I want to tell you my story. And she cried. And it's really challenging to not cry as well when some of the stories are incredibly distressing. But you know, that to approach it with empathy, that's part of this feminist ethos in the way of doing interviews. And the last way that I incorporate it is to mainstream women's experiences in the book. So by mainstreaming, I mean, for example, I don't have a chapter on sexual violence where this is women's story is all about sexual violence and that's it. Sexual violence does appear in the book. It is unavoidable because sexual violence against girls and women in genocide is ubiquitous and horrific. And it is definitely in the book. But it's not positioned in a way that says this is the only experience of women in genocide and this is what we should focus on. So that was important to me to mainstream that actually all the way through all of these human rights violations, women also experience those. So it's not just about the sexual violence. So that's the variety of ways that I implemented feminist practice.
Because we're almost out of time, genocide studies is a multidisciplinary field. You're obviously an international law expert. Please explain, sorry, as briefly as you possibly can, how international law fits into your analysis of the genocide process, even though you've already touched on this already, and how non-law genocide scholars like myself and also legal scholars can learn from discrimination to death.
Yeah, so as you said, I've touched on a little bit already, but what I can say is I use a lot of different sources of international law in this book. So I refer to treaties, case law from international courts, what we call soft law, which is things like, for example, General Assembly resolutions or commentary from human rights treaty bodies. And I also use customary law, which is not necessarily written, but binding law. So genocide, for example, is customary law, regardless of the Genocide Convention. It's prohibited for all countries in the world. So I use all of those. And at the beginning of each chapter, I draw on those sources to explain what that particular human right or human rights are that I'm looking at in that chapter. And my goal of that is really to help non-law genocide scholars understand human rights better. Because I would find these books called Genocide and Human Rights, and then there's no mention of human rights at all in the book. So that the phrase is being used, the term's being used, but then not being incorporated. So I'm hoping that genocide scholars will find this really useful. For lawyers, judges and legal scholars, I'm hoping that it will be useful for them in the prosecution, but also proving, for judges making decisions about genocide and whether it has taken place. Essentially, I'm hoping it will help prove genocide in court. And in a particular example of that, my chapter on the refugee stage, I'm really hoping that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court will be able to use to bring genocide charges in the case against the Rohingya by arguing that the experience of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, which is a state party to the International Criminal Court, that experience counts as part of the process, and therefore we can bring genocide charges against those Burmese perpetrators located in Myanmar. So fingers crossed.
I'll close by saying thank you for the book. Thank you for your study. As a non-legal genocide scholar, I found that introduction, that I would use the word contextualization, very useful, because I've never studied human rights or human rights law at all. But thank you overall for your work, especially for this latest contribution. And I hope that you seriously mull over my suggestion about a book or at least a study on Australia.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad that you found it easy to read. Yes, and I can hold up my copy as well. It's not as an exciting cover, you know, Routledge, we have all the same covers, unfortunately, but I hope that, you know, the audience will, that has piqued your interest, and that you'll read it and find it useful for your own research as well.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie and Panos, for this interesting discussion. It was great to know a little bit more about the book, about all the human rights issues that you address, touching upon children, feminist perspective, which, you know, on the Day of Women, it's necessary also to mention. Thank you very much for your discussion. And with this, I'll be closing our webinar. And I will just say that our next webinar will be on the 29th of March, and we'll be having Dr. Onur Uraz in conversation with Dr. Shannon Faith about his book, Classifying Genocide in International Law, the Substantial Requirement. Thank you very much to everybody.